I didn't shut down a luxury golf course because I wanted revenge. I shut it down because they cut down something they had absolutely no right to touch. And by the time they realized how badly they'd messed up, their brand new $1 million project was already bleeding money by the day. The funny part is, the whole thing started with a smile. Not an angry confrontation, not a threat, not some dramatic property dispute. Just one of those polished corporate smiles that says, "We're going to get what we want, and eventually you'll understand why." About 9 years ago, I bought a house on the edge of a quiet community outside a city called Ashford Ridge. Nothing special. No fancy gates. No waterfront views. Just a comfortable neighborhood where people waved at each other and life moved slowly enough that you actually noticed the seasons changing. The one unusual thing about the property was what sat behind it. A private golf club. Now, before anyone imagines me sipping cocktails with rich retirees, let me stop you right there. I don't golf. Never have. I couldn't tell you the difference between half the clubs in a golf bag. What sold me on the house wasn't the course. It was the trees. 4 enormous red oak trees stood along the back of my property. Not little decorative trees. These things were giants. Thick trunks. Massive canopies. The kind of trees that make you wonder how many generations had walked past them before you ever showed up. Those trees gave me everything I wanted. Privacy. Shade. Peace. When golfers passed through the fairway behind my house, I barely noticed them. They couldn't see much of my yard, and I couldn't see much of them. It was the perfect arrangement. Before I bought the property, I paid extra attention to the survey. Twice, actually. Maybe that sounds boring, but anyone who's owned property long enough knows boundary disputes can turn neighbors into enemies faster than almost anything else. I wanted certainty, and there was no uncertainty. Those trees sat comfortably inside my property line. Not on the boundary. Not close to the boundary. Mine. For years, life was easy. The golf club was old-fashioned and honestly a little run down. Most of the members were retirees who spent more time talking than golfing. The clubhouse looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 90s. I liked it that way. Then everything changed. A development company bought the entire golf club. Within months, construction crews were everywhere. New landscaping, new roads, new buildings. Rumors started spreading through the neighborhood about luxury memberships, exclusive events, premium homes overlooking the course. Property values started climbing. So did egos. One afternoon, I was mowing the lawn when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out, mid-40s, expensive shoes, perfect haircut, the kind of guy who looked like he practiced presentations in hotel mirrors. He introduced himself as Ryan Mercer, project director for the redevelopment project. At first, the conversation was pleasant enough. He complimented the property, talked about improvements, spoke about the future vision for the club. I remember standing there thinking, okay, where's this going? Then he casually glanced toward the trees. And there it was, the real reason he'd stopped by. Beautiful oaks, he said. I nodded. They really are. He smiled. Only problem is they block a pretty incredible view from one of our plant tee boxes. I didn't answer right away, because I already knew what came next. Sure enough, he kept talking. Nothing direct, nothing aggressive, just little comments. How the redesign would benefit everyone. How the neighborhood would become more prestigious. How visibility was important for the premium golfing experience. Finally, I cut through all of it. Those trees are on my property. His smile never moved. Of course, he said. We completely respect private property. Maybe you've met someone like that. The words sound perfect, but something underneath them feels wrong. The conversation ended politely. He drove away, and for some reason, I watched his SUV disappear down the street a little longer than necessary. I couldn't explain why. I just had a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when a storm is still miles away, but somehow you can already smell the rain. A few weeks later, I left town to visit my sister for a long weekend. Nothing unusual. The house was fine when I left. The trees were standing. Everything was exactly as it had been for nearly a decade. Then I came home, and before I even opened the back door, something felt wrong. The sunlight looked different, brighter, harsher, like somebody had removed a wall from the world while I was gone. I stepped onto my patio, and my stomach dropped. The trees were gone. Not damaged. Not trimmed. Gone. For giant red oaks that had stood there for decades had been reduced to flat stumps lined up across the back of my yard. No branches, no debris, no mess, just empty space. And beyond that empty space, sitting proudly on the golf course side, was a brand new elevated tee box overlooking everything that used to be hidden, including my backyard, including my patio, including my home. For a few seconds, I honestly couldn't move. I just stood there staring at those stumps, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. But deep down, I already knew exactly what had happened. And the worst part? I was about to find out that cutting down my trees wasn't even the biggest mistake they had made. The next morning, I walked straight over to the golf course. Not because I wanted to fight. Honestly, I was still trying to process what I was looking at. When something that permanent disappears overnight, your brain almost refuses to accept it. I must have stared at those stumps 20 times before leaving the house. Every time I looked at them, I expected the trees to somehow still be there. They weren't. A maintenance crew was working near the fairway behind my property, so I headed over. I asked one of the workers if he knew what happened to the trees. He barely looked up from what he was doing. Those trees, he said. Yeah, we took them down. Just like that. No hosetastion. No concern. Like he was talking about weeds. I asked who authorized it. He shrugged. Management. I pointed toward my property. You know those trees weren't on golf course land, right? Another shrug. We just do what we're told. That answer irritated me more than I expected. Not because the workers were responsible. They weren't. But because it confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't an accident. Nobody accidentally removes 4 massive oak trees. Somebody made a decision. Somebody approved it. Somebody signed off on it. And whoever did apparently assumed nobody would challenge them. I went home and pulled out every document I had from when I bought the property. Survey maps, closing paperwork, property records, everything. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a temporary law office. The survey was crystal clear. The property line sat several feet beyond every stump. There was no gray area, no interpretación, no confusión. The trees belonged to me. The following day, I hired an independent survey company. If there's one thing life has taught me, it's that being right and proving you're right are 2 completely different things. 2 days later, bright orange survey markers appeared across the back of my yard. The surveyor walked the boundary with me personally. He checked measurements twice, compared old records, verified coordinates. Then he looked at the stumps and shook his head. They weren't even close, he said. That sentence stuck with me. They weren't even close. I took photographs from every possible angle. Survey markers, property lines, the stumps, the new tee box, everything. Then I started digging into the redevelopment project itself. And that's where things got interesting. At first, I was just looking for basic construction information. Permits, approvals, site plans, public records. Nothing exciting. But the more I read, the stranger things became. One document mentioned environmental buffers. Another referenced safety screening requirements. Then I found a site plan showing the exact area behind my house. The same area where my trees had stood. I stared at that page for a long time. Because according to the approved plans, there was supposed to be a protective visual and safety buffer separating residential property from the new elevated tee box. A buffer, right where my trees had been. Now, I'm not an engineer. I'm not a developer. But even I understood what that meant. The trees weren't just decoration. They served a purpose. They blocked visibility. They reduced noise. And maybe most importantly, they helped protect nearby homes from errant golf balls. The more I researched, the more obvious it became. Those trees weren't interfering with the project. They were part of what allowed the project to exist in the first place. That realization changed everything. Until that moment, I thought this was a property dispute. Now it looked like something much bigger. I spent the next several days reading through county records and permit conditions. Not exactly exciting weekend entertainment, but every page moved the puzzle closer to completion. Eventually, a pattern emerged. The redevelopment company had received approval for the premium tee box under specific conditions. Those conditions existed because elevated tee boxes create additional risks. Different sight lines, different ball trajectories, different exposure to neighboring properties. The county approved the design because mitigating protections existed. Protections that included the natural tree buffer, the same buffer that no longer existed. And suddenly, a very uncomfortable question appeared. If the permit required the buffer, how exactly did they think removing it was going to work? Maybe they assumed nobody would notice. Maybe they assumed homeowners wouldn't understand permit language. Maybe they thought they could replace the trees later and avoid scrutiny. I still don't know. But I do know one thing. At that point, I stopped thinking about the trees. The trees were already gone. Nothing could change that. Instead, I started focusing on leverage. Because every dispute has a pressure point. You just have to find it. For several days, I organized everything. Photographs, survey reports, permit documents, county records, construction plans. I built a timeline showing exactly what had happened and when. No emotion, no exaggeration, just facts. Then I filed a formal complaint with the county planning department. I attached every piece of evidence. The survey, the photographs, the permit references, the missing buffer. And then I waited. Most people assume government offices move slowly. And a lot of the time that's true. But there's one thing that tends to accelerate attention. Liability. About 8 days later, I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when I noticed a white county vehicle pull into the golf course service road. Then another one. 2 inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards. I remember watching through the window and thinking, well, this just got real. They spent nearly 2 hours behind my property, measuring, photographing, reviewing plans, comparing documents. Neither one said much. Professionals haredo. One of them eventually walked over and introduced himself. He asked if I was the homeowner who filed the complaint. I said yes. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Have golf balls entered your property since the trees were removed? I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the timing was almost perfect. As of this morning, I said, I found 2. The inspector nodded and wrote something down. Then he looked toward the tee box, then back toward my house. And I watched the realization happen in real time. Without the trees, there was a direct line between active play and my backyard. No video, no protection, no screening, nothing. The second inspector spent several minutes standing on the elevated tee box itself. From where I stood, I could see him looking directly into my patio area, then at my windows, then at the neighboring homes, then back at his clipboard. Neither inspector offered an opinion. They didn't need to. The silence told me everything. Before leaving, one of them thanked me for my time. Professional, neutral, completely unreadable. But less than 24 hours later, the county made their position very clear. An official notice was issued. And when I opened the document, I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Immediate stop use order. The brand new premium tee box was officially shut down. No play, no events, no member access, nothing. Just like that, one of the centerpiece attractions of the entire redevelopment project became unusable. And judging by what happened next, the people running that project were absolutely not prepared for the consequences. Because 2 days later, there was a knock on my front door. And standing there was Ryan Mercer. Only this time, that confident corporate smile was nowhere to be found. For the first time since this entire situation started, he looked worried. And what he said after I opened the door told me the county's order was costing them far more than anyone had expected. I opened the door, and for a second neither of us said anything. Ryan looked different. Same expensive clothes. Same polished appearance. But the confidence was gone. A few weeks earlier, he'd looked like a man managing a successful project. Now he looked like a man trying to stop a problem from becoming a disaster. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He immediately launched into an explanation. There had been a misunderstanding. The landscaping contractor believed the trees were inside golf club property. The removal wasn't intentional. The company respected private property rights. The crew acted on incorrect information. Honestly, it sounded like a statement prepared by 3 attorneys and a public relations consultant. I listened quietly, didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't help him. When he finally finished, I asked a simple question. Who verified the property line before they cut them down? The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 30, because we both knew the answer. Nobody had. Ryan looked away for a moment. Then he shifted to the next phase. The solution. They want to make things right. The golf club would plant replacement trees along the boundary. Fast-growing species. Professionally landscaped. Beautiful visual screening. He used all the right words. Unfortunately for him, I had spent the previous 2 weeks reading permit documents. So I shook my head. Small trees don't replace a functional buffer. His expression changed. Just slightly. But enough. Because now he realized we weren't discussing landscaping anymore. We were discussing compliance. The county didn't care whether the replacement looked nice. The county cared whether it provided the protection required by the approved development plan. And everybody knew a few decorative saplings weren't going to accomplish that. For the first time during the conversation, Ryan seemed genuinely frustrated. Not angry. Cornered. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then I looked past him toward the empty space where 4 giant oaks used to stand. The sympathy disappeared pretty quickly. That's when I told him something I hadn't mentioned to anyone yet. With the buffer gone and golf balls already entering my property, I've been consulting local ordinances regarding protective structures. His eyes narrowed. What kind of structure? I shrugged. Maybe a safety fence. He nodded cautiously. That sounded reasonable. Then I continued. A tall one. His face didn't move. How tall? I looked directly at him. 20 feet. That got his attention. Immediately. Now, technically, a protective structure built entirely on private property for safety purposes was well within my rights under local regulations. I had already confirmed that, and a 20-foot barrier wouldn't violate any restrictions. The moment he understood what I was saying, I watched the math happen in his head. The premium tee box depended on its elevated panoramic view. Members paid extra for that experience. Marketing materials highlighted that experience. Future home sales were partially built around that experience. A 20-foot wall would erase that experience. Completely. The tee box could eventually reopen, but golfers would be staring at a giant barrier instead of a scenic fairway. Years of planning reduced to a very expensive disappointment. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ryan sighed. What do you want? There it was. The question. Not what will make you happy. Not what seems fair. What do you want? Because he already knew this wasn't going away. I walked inside and returned with a folder. Inside was an estimate from a company specializing in mature tree relocation. Not young trees. Not decorative landscaping. Real trees. Large red oaks. The closest thing possible to restoring what had been taken. The estimate included transportation, installation, root stabilization systems, structural support, irrigation modifications, and additional protective netting on the golf course side until the trees fully established themselves. The number wasn't small. Ryan opened the document. Read it. Then read it again. I could practically hear the gears turning. Because while the estimate was expensive, the alternative was becoming even more expensive. Every day the tee box remained closed cost money. Every complaint from members cost money. Every delayed marketing campaign cost money. Every conversation explaining why the showcase feature of the redevelopment couldn't be used cost money. For the first time since we'd met, the balance of power had completely shifted. Not because I had more resources. Not because I had a better lawyer. Because facts had put me in control of the timeline. And timelines are expensive. Ryan folded the estimate. I'll take this back to ownership. I nodded. That was Friday. Monday afternoon, he was back. This time the meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. No excuses. No explanations. No corporate language. Just a decision. They agreed to everything. Every single item. The trees. The installation. The support systems. The protective netting. All of it. A few weeks later, enormous trucks rolled into the area. Neighbors came outside to watch. Honestly, it looked like a movie set. Massive equipment. Cranes. Specialized crews. Trees taller than some houses moving slowly down the road. People stopped their cars just to stare. One older neighbor walked over and laughed. I've lived here 20 years, he said. I've never seen anyone spend this much money fixing a mistake. Neither had I. Over the following months, the property slowly began to look familiar again. Not identical, You can't instantly replace decades of growth, but close. Close enough that the privacy returned. Close enough that the protection returned. Close enough that the county eventually approved reopening the tee box. And that's how the story officially ended. But honestly, that's not the part one think about most. The part one remember happened much later. Several months after everything was resolved, I was sitting on my patio one evening watching the sunset. The new trees were settling in. The course was operating normally again. The drama was over. And I found myself thinking about how differently the whole thing could have gone. If I had exploded with anger the first day, if I'd started screaming at workers, if I'd threatened lawsuits before understanding the facts, if I'd let frustration drive every decision, I probably would have spent a fortune fighting a battle I didn't fully understand. Instead, I got curious. Then I got organized. Then I got patient. And that's really the lesson. Most people assume power comes from being louder. In reality, power usually comes from understanding something the other side overlooked. The golf club didn't lose because they lacked money. They lost because they assumed nobody would verify what they were doing. And that's a mistake people make every day. Not just companies, neighbors, HOAs, contractors, even friends. They assume confidence will go unquestioned until somebody starts checking facts. Now here's the part that usually starts arguments whenever I tell this story. Some people think I should have sued them for even more. Others think I should have accepted the first apology and moved on. A few people have told me shutting down part of the project was excessive. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. Personally, I don't think I shut anything down. I think they shut themselves down the moment they decided somebody else's property was less important than their own plans. But I'd love to hear what you think. If you came home and found something valuable on your property, deliberately removed without permission, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have fought harder? Would you have accepted the apology? Or would you have built the 20-foot fence just to make a point? Let me know down in the comments because I read more of them than you might think. And if you enjoy stories about real people standing their ground, not through shouting, but through strategy, documentation, and patience, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.